Hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's episode of Beginner Breakdown. My name, as per usual, is Alex Moellering, and I'm excited to be sharing this lesson with you today. This one is geared especially towards people who are just starting their chess career. You know how to move the pieces, you know about check and checkmate and what those words mean, you know, all the basic rules. But you're really trying to figure out if I'm looking at any given position, what's a good place to start to try and figure out what to do. And I've done other videos on, game analysis and kind of evaluating positions, and this is going to focus on one specific element that I think can really take someone who doesn't know much and turn them into, a reasonable contender when you're looking for moves. So we're going to start by talking about unprotected pieces. Whenever you're playing a chess game, this is usually more often in the middle game or end game, but there are some opening traps about this. There are times where you will put a piece on a square where it is not defended. That means none of your pieces could capture it if it was taken by an opponent's piece. And using this, we're going to look for both our own pieces that are unprotected and our opponents, and that's going to be a really good starting point. So I'll explain it as we go, but I want to start with an opening example. So this is an opening called the Ponziani opening. It starts with pawn to e4, black plays pawn to e5, knight to f3 attacking the pawn, knight to c6 defending. And here there's a lot of usual moves. You can play a Spanish game with bishop to b5, or an Italian game with bishop to c4. Oops. You can play a Scotch game with pawn to d4. You can play four knights. You got a lot of options here. But the move, pawn to c3, begins the Ponziani. And the idea is kind of interesting. While this does occupy the square our knight would like to go to, it does add an extra defender to d4. And the hope is that white will be able to play d4 and then recapture and maintain a strong center with their pawns. So this is what white would like to do. Now, one common response is to play knight to f6 and to say, well, the normal move you would like to play as white here is to defend this pawn by playing knight to c3. So now you can't do that. And instead of defending this pawn, white often will play pawn to d4 anyway, continuing with their plan and hoping to generate some counterplay. Now, there are lots of ways that both sides can go about this and already have changed, made different decisions. But one particular line that is relevant for our discussion today is knight takes e4, so black captures this pawn, and instead of recapturing on e5, white plays pawn to d5, displacing black's c6 knight, with the idea that in the future we will recapture on e5. Probably the best move here is to play knight to e7, but let's imagine knight to b8 is played. This does get seen every now and again. A very tricky move here is to, instead of recapturing the pawn immediately, which might run into some danger after queen to e7, and there being the queen online with our king and some discovered check ideas, white plays the move bishop to e3 and sets a trap. Because now, a very, very natural move is for black to say, oh, well, you didn't take my pawn, so I guess I'm going to defend it. I'm not going to let you do it. And there's a few ways to do it. You could maybe play like bishop to d6 or queen to e7, but these moves seem a little suspicious because, you don't generally want to blockade your own pieces. If queen goes to e7, then this bishop is going to have a hard time developing. And if the bishop goes to d6, then this bishop is going to have a hard time developing because this pawn is in the way. So instead, black plays a very natural looking move, pawn to d6. And in this position, there is a serious problem because black has fallen right for the trap. They've played this natural move, and the way we highlight that is look for the unprotected pieces. There's a very obvious one in this position, which is why I like to start with it, and that's this knight here on e4. Certainly, if we were able to take that piece, nothing would defend it. And here's kind of a principle I want you to apply when you're looking for tactics. In your chess games, if your opponent has more than one unprotected piece, or if they have at least one unprotected piece and their king is exposed, then there's often tactical opportunities. So really be aware of times when the king is exposed, meaning there's some avenue you can use to attack it with a check or something similar, and or possibly a checkmate threat, and there's unprotected pieces. In this example, the move to win for white is queen to a4 check, attacking the king and hitting the knight. This is a classic fork where one piece of ours attacks two of our opponents, and they can only save one. So in this case, black will play some move to protect their king, but we will happily eat up this knight. And white is doing quite well. We have a piece for a pawn. So this is something we are very happy with. And the way we found that, now this is certainly an opening trap, so probably whoever is playing this already knows what's going on, but it's possible that this scenario just happens in a game. Regardless, what I want you to focus on is look out for, again, opportunities where your opponent has one or more unprotected pieces, or even if they just have one and their king is exposed, then there's often opportunities for tactics. So I want to show one more example here. This is maybe a more natural middle game. A lot of things have been traded. Black is up a pawn, presumably because they were able to take a pawn here on b2 with their queen at some point in the game. But it's kind of complicated. White might have a slight lead in development and control of the center, so it's arguable who's doing better here. But either way, in this position, black plays a really problematic move. Instead of taking this free pawn on d5, although maybe there are some issues with discoveries, black decides to play knight takes e4 and simply trade the pieces, and their expectation is white will recapture and the game will continue. Black is up material, so they should be happy to trade and simplify the position. But here, if white takes a second, even in the middle of a capture, which seems so obvious to just, oh, I just need to recapture, and looks at the opponent's unprotected pieces, we might be able to learn something really fascinating. So if we look at black's side of the board, certainly this rook is unprotected, although it's also pretty hard to attack, so good to keep in mind, but not an immediate issue. This bishop on e7 is unprotected. Okay, so that's good to know. This queen is also unprotected. But you'll find that generally speaking, it doesn't matter so much whether the queen is protected or not, because she has such a wide range of mobility. Now, there are times where it can matter, but the queen being unprotected is usually not your first instinct that I have a tactic here, because she can usually respond effectively. But okay, so this bishop and this rook. And now it's white's turn to move and to consider how we want to capture this knight. And so maybe some people would think, okay, well, I'll just capture with the bishop and centralize the piece. Looks fine to me, and there's probably nothing wrong with that. But if we look a little closer, we might realize that if we capture this with the queen, then we now create two threats. One is against this unprotected bishop, but now notice we also have set up a battery where our queen works with our the queen will be on e4 where the knight is. I'll just play that on the board. And now this battery is set up towards our opponent's king, and we threaten checkmate. So this is kind of like that example where I was saying it doesn't always have to be an exposed king. In this case, the king is doing fine. It's just there's a checkmate threatened. So because we are able to line this up, and there's an unprotected piece here, black will not be able to stop both threats. They'll need to do something to save the king, perhaps pawn to g6, and we can happily gobble up this extra bishop. And now white is doing really well. So again, these are the things you want to watch out for in your positions. Even in just something as innocuous as a simple capture and a simple exchange, look out for where your opponent's unprotected pieces are and see if you can find ways to attack multiple of them at once or generate threats against the king and those pieces. So now we're going to look at a few different examples. For any and all of these, if you're watching this live, then feel free to guess in the chat at what the answer might be. In this position, it's black to move. And if you are watching this later on YouTube, please feel free to pause the video. I might not stay on these for super long, but feel free to pause and try and find the best move for each example. So in this case, it is black's turn to move. And our first question again is to try and identify where are the unprotected pieces. Once again, this queen here is not protected, but hard to attack a queen. If we have a knight, sometimes that'll do it, but not so helpful. Okay, what else is unprotected? let's see. At first it might look like this pawn is unprotected, but the knight covers it. And all of these pawns actually happen to be protected, save this one on a2. So maybe there's a chance to attack that. But I think the really critical factor of this position is that this knight on d2 is not protected. And as someone already has found in the chat, Sekuli Labambo, excellent name, has suggested queen to g5. Noticing that it both attacks this knight, and because our opponent's castle is somewhat destroyed, we have these doubled pawns here, queen to g5 will attack both the knight and our opponent's king, and similarly they cannot save both. So the king will have to make some move. Wherever it goes, we will take the knight. So again, hopefully this kind of concept makes sense. We're going to be kind of drilling this same thing over and over again. So our next example here, it's white's turn to move. And again, we want to look for those loose pieces. Welcome in, learn, practice, LM prove. Improve. Learn, practice, improve. Wonderful name. So here it is white's turn to move again. And there's a lot of pieces on the board, so it can look complicated, but a really nice way you can simplify what's going on is to start by looking for your opponent's undefended pieces. Okay, we have queen to b3 suggested, although that's not a legal move, so I think you might have just mistyped. Yes, you edited it. Queen to b5, and so Lediondon and Gabrielle Halar, I apologize for any mispronunciations of any of your usernames, have found queen to b5. Once again, hitting this unprotected bishop and this exposed king. We have an avenue to attack, and so queen to b5 will take care of it. Whatever move black plays here, say queen to d7, we can pick up the free piece. Okay, so, and this is something as a note that you want to apply both to your own position and your opponent's. So some players will really hyper-fixate on the attacking opportunities they have and look for their opponent's undefended pieces and just go after them without any regard for their own self-preservation. It's a really good idea also to be aware of which pieces on your side are unprotected, or if your king is exposed, and keep an eye out for your opponent's threats, because they're going to be doing the same thing you are. Okay, here's our next example here. The last few of these have been focused on finding a way to attack an unprotected piece and exploit the fact that the king has some exposure issues. This one, the king is very well guarded, and it's really hard to find a way to attack the king. But there is an issue with some unprotected pieces here in the black camp. So white's turn to move. If you have any suggestions or ideas for how we might punish black for not protecting their pieces, just kind of, some people will call these hanging pieces or hanging pawns, or loose pieces, loose pawns, but whatever terms you would like to use, see if you can find the best way for white to progress in this position. All right, we have some suggestions in the chat. Once again, reminder, if you're on YouTube, always feel free to pause. But queen to d1 here is the correct move. Noticing that this knight is on the side of the board, you is correct, James Lee. This is, yeah, we don't like knights on the edge. A knight on the rim is grim in most cases, and it's not protected by anything, so it's a loose piece. And queen d1 hits the knight and also picks up this bishop on d6, which is also unprotected. I also think this bishop is kind of ew because the pawn is unable to move. So yeah, this piece placement is not great, and queen d1 exploits that really well. If they try and save the knight, we can take the bishop. And if they try and save the bishop, we can take the knight. Again, this is all happening because of forks that we're seeing, and we'll see some other examples of tactics we can use to go after unprotected pieces. But the general principle, all of it starts from seeing which pieces are particularly weak in our opponent's side of the board. All right, white to move here. Yeah, free pieces are incredibly yummy. I highly recommend eating them up, eating as many of your opponent's pieces as you can find. So white to move here, and again, find the winning idea because black's pieces, or at least one of them, is not very well positioned. And especially it's not protected. So in this position, white to move, a lot of candidate moves In a normal position, right, if you're not really paying super close attention, castling looks like a great idea, and it probably is. Maybe pushing this pawn, or maybe moving the queen to try and find a way to develop this bishop. There's lots of potential ideas. But when you start to look at these positions by noticing that some of the pieces are unprotected, then you can find really nice ways in. And several people in the chat have found the move. It's queen to h5, both hitting the king and this bishop, which is unprotected. The bishop on f5 is defended, whether it be by the knight, so whether it goes here or stays here. You can't take that, but whatever is played to defend the king, the bishop on h6 does fall. All right, another example here. In this position, again, white to move. And some people are probably immediately going ew, seeing this gross knight on the rim once again. And that's a good thing. You should react quite strongly when you see these poorly placed pieces. But it's not really effective unless you know how to punish poorly placed pieces. And I guess we are working on principles for punishing poorly placed pieces in this position. All right, enough with the alliteration. Kaleidoscope Guy, I think I've seen you in the chat before. Glad to have you back. And great idea, queen to d5, hitting the knight, and also very cleverly hitting this rook on a8. In some of the earlier examples, we might not have been paying as much attention to these rooks because often they're guarded. But in this case, because it's unprotected and a second piece is unprotected, we have an excellent avenue to attack. Bishop g5, suggested by Jay Smith, is not a bad move. You are attacking the queen. It just, unfortunately, there are ways to stop that problem. Perhaps just dropping the knight back to f6, and some of our tactical opportunities will disappear. So that's okay. I'm glad to have you make a suggestion here and take a guess. But queen d5 is better because we are going to be able to win a piece by force. You cannot save both the rook and the knight. All right, another example here. And this one involves something I've talked about in previous lectures called forcing moves, which is a very famous and very important topic in chess. So if you're unfamiliar, feel free to check out that lecture, or there's lots of books and content on forcing moves. It's a really critical idea. But we're going to use that to our advantage here to find a really nice opportunity. This is probably the hardest puzzle we've had so far. So if it takes you a little bit more time, don't feel bad in the slightest. But it is black to move. Material is completely equal. And James Lee, I believe you have the right idea, but I want someone to be more specific. I think you know what it is, but I just want to see some notation here for how to do it. So does anyone have the right idea? Give it a little bit more time, and then we will reveal the answer. Okay, someone else in the chat, Vinicius, excellent name, Medieros, Vinicius, welcome in. Queen to e1 is the perfect start here. Check, and this is a forcing move. So a forcing move, just very quickly, is any move that forces your opponent to respond in a limited number of ways. Checks are usually the most famous example of that, because they have to do something to save the king. It is against the rules of the game not to. In this case, after queen to e1, this king will be forced to h2. And from here, we find that this king is exposed, and this rook, being unprotected, is vulnerable to a fork on e5. The king again has to move somewhere, and we pick up the rook. Looking very good for black. Okay, excellent job. One more example of this kind of similar thematic, although this time, notably, there are queens off the board. So this tactic of, or just this general principle of looking for unprotected pieces does not require that you have a queen on the board. She is very, very helpful because she attacks on the diagonal and the vertical and horizontal lines. So she covers a lot of ground and can hit pieces on really different parts of the board. So often, those are probably the most common examples, but something like this, also when applied with forcing moves, can help us find other ways to pick up unprotected pieces. And this one is, again, kind of tough. All right, a few people in the chat, Cabajul, Taylor Webb, both of you want to play, and James Lee, Vinicius, all of you got it. Rook takes c8 check. A forcing move, I mean, black could move the king out of the way, but then you just lose a rook. So bishop takes, the natural move. And now rook to d8, check, winning the bishop by forking. And I really like this puzzle in particular because in this position, no one's paying attention to these two pieces because they're both protected, right? The bishop is defended by the pawn and it's defending the rook. This knight is unprotected and it looks like it's the big target. But using your forcing moves and calculating that if I take this rook, they have to take back, and then the bishop becomes undefended, and this king being exposed becomes a big issue, it can lead you to find these really nice ideas. Okay, we're going to look at now a slightly different idea. This one is not too hard, but let's see what you all can do. Black to move, and in this position, we're always going to be looking for the unprotected pieces, but there's something different about what's going on here and how we're going to be able to win them. So black to move and play the only winning move. Oh, yeah, in the previous example, yeah, it looked like checkmate. Unfortunately, the king still had a square, but we did manage to pick up a bishop. So black should still be winning quite well. No worries at all. Okay. Yeah, a few people have found this one as well, and the idea is bishop to f6, and this is actually a pin. So a pin is another kind of tactic. The thing about unprotected pieces is you can really apply so many tactics, and learning about tactics is going to help you, when you see an unprotected piece, know which one to apply to what situation. In this case, we are attacking this knight, and we are pinning it to the rook. Neither of these pieces are protected, and if the knight moves anywhere, then the more important piece, the rook, falls. But if the knight doesn't move, it's not protected, and there's actually no move that does protect it. The rook would love to come to c1 and defend it through its own pawn, but that's unfortunately not possible. So whatever move is played, white will be losing material, at least a knight and possibly even a rook. All right, here's a similar example. White to move and play the only winning move. Is this a forced check trade leading to an endgame? In the previous example, let me think really briefly. No, I think you can just win this material, and black's going to be able to, or sorry, white's going to be able to keep the rook in that example, but you'll be up a piece. Okay. In this position, yes, back to this one, white to move, and we have a suggestion here, rook to d1. So again, when we first look, I think forcing moves are a great thing to look at, trades and exchanges, but we notice that, again, black has an unprotected piece. That's the theme here of this lesson is unprotected pieces, so constantly be looking out for those, with this rook on d8. And not only is it unprotected, it's also very hard to protect because the king is pretty far away. And so putting the rook on d1 pins the bishop to the rook. If bishop takes bishop, then we do not recapture. Instead, because if we recapture here, then we actually are in big trouble. We first take the rook because this is check. After the king moves, then we recapture the bishop, and we have an extra rook. And extra rooks are really, really good rooks. One tricky thing about this situation is if king to f8 is played just waiting, you want to be careful about how you take this. You can take it either way, but if we take with the bishop, then black has this annoying move, king to e7. And now there's a bit of a counter pin on our rook on d1 because it is unprotected. One critical difference, though, as some of you probably have spotted, is whenever we move this bishop, we can carefully place it somewhere, either here on a4 or on g4, where it defends the rook itself. So not a perfect pin from black's end, but it was a better try than before. Some people might have just given it up. But probably simpler is to just take with the rook, and you don't have to worry about any of it. All right, one more example here. Again, on this type of theme we're looking through. It is white to move, and see if you can find the best idea, starting by looking for unprotected pieces and exposed kings. In this case, there are both, but the king is not the most relevant part of this position. So white to move, and if they didn't have this move, then black would have a serious advantage because black is up a pawn and has this nice 3-on-2 over here. But unfortunately, as James Lee and Kaleidoscope Guy have both pointed out, rook to f8 is pinning this knight to this undefended rook on a8. Now the knight can't move because the rook is undefended. If this rook were defended, then it's okay to move the piece because it would be a trade, even a rook for a rook. Sometimes a pin has, you're pinning a more valuable piece like a queen or a rook by a bishop, and so you don't want to move that piece either way. In this case, if the rook was defended, this wouldn't work, but because the knight can't move, they're in serious trouble. So whatever move black plays, unfortunately there's not enough time because your follow-up will be bishop to f4, attacking the pinned piece, and black has no way to save both. All right, so now let's jump into some quick combination of the previous two examples. So we looked at some pins and forks and how they can be used to apply tactical pressure when your opponent has either an exposed king, unprotected pieces, or some combination. And here we are going to apply both of those at the same time. We can spot that our opponent's king is somewhat exposed and their rook here on c7 is not protected. And as someone, Kaleidoscope Guy in the chat, has already pointed out, knight to d5 is an excellent move. The rook is pinning this c6 pawn, so it cannot capture our knight, which means that after the king moves, we pick up the rook. Our next example here, and in the live audience, if you have ideas on our positions as well, please feel free to comment. In this position, it's black to move, and our theme today is unprotected pieces. So we're starting by looking at which pieces our opponent has that are not protected, and seeing if we can find a way to exploit that with a tactic, be it a pin or a fork or some other idea. All right, a few people in chat have the right idea. So this is a kind of complex position. This rook on a8 is a little funky. It's not defended, but also fairly hard to attack without moving our knight. This bishop is attacking our knight. This knight is guarding the king. But sadly, there is a pin in this position. Our rook on g8 is, or I should say sadly for white. This is great if you're black. Our rook on g8 is pinning the knight on g3 to the king, which means this knight is not guarding e2 like it normally would, allowing us to play knight e2 and fork the king and bishop, and we will pick one of them up. Again, exposed king and unprotected piece often means you will be able to find a tactical idea to win you some material. All right, so now we're going to introduce a third type of tactic. We've looked at forks and pins and how they relate to these pieces. This one is a third, and before I spoil what it is, let's see what you all in the chat can find. White to move and play the best move. How can we win some material here as white? This one's a little harder. But again, if you're having trouble, I recommend starting by finding your opponent's unprotected pieces and seeing if you can exploit them in certain ways. All right, so in this position, a few things going on. There's actually a lot of unprotected pieces in our opponent's camp. This knight is not protected. This bishop is not protected. And this pawn here is not protected. The rooks defend each other, and everything else is defended by one of these pieces, the king or one of the rooks. And so it's kind of hard to keep track. Okay, I have these three to look for, but something else we can notice is we can only really attack one of them. I guess you could play bishop to f4 and attack this pawn, but like we said, if we can just attack one, that's usually not good enough because our opponent will find a way to defend. We want to play moves that make multiple threats. So in this case, James Lee, I think you have the right instinct with wanting to take that pawn. If we take on g6, then there's a problem. One, we took a pawn, which is always good. But two, we are threatening to capture not only a second pawn, but also open up our rook to take this knight on f6. It is not defended. So after f takes g6, this knight gets hit, and black needs to do something about it. If they move the knight, then they're in serious trouble, because if this knight goes, say, to g4, now this pawn is attacked by our rook and pawn, and we can fork the king and rook. So that's no good. So instead, probably something like king to g7. And from here, we can even add more insult to injury as white. So see if we can find a really nice move in this position. Indiana Jones 2022, OMG, right back at you. So what can we do as white? This is a little bit of a bonus point here to try and find the best move. Yes, bishop to c3. Pinning once again this knight, even though it's protected, it's only protected once by the king, and now it's attacked twice. It's pinned to the king, so it can't move, and there's just no other good way to defend it. Probably the best here is to choose to sacrifice the rook. Rook to, or I'm sorry, not rook e6, but rook e5. Just getting in the way, and at least you're picking up this bishop for the rook. So you're down in exchange, but white is doing quite well here. Okay. Next one. Oh, and if I didn't say, I think I may have, but just in case. This type of tactic is called a discovery. So we're going to move one piece out of the way and reveal the attack of another piece, which is going to be really, really helpful. All right, in this case, it is black to move. Again, a pretty complicated position. White is up 2 pawns, and they are marching down the board, trying to promote into a queen. Black is pretty short up defensively, and we have our bishop, nicely infiltrating these light squares, but it's not quite enough at the moment. What can we do to gain an advantage? And again, remember, start with the unprotected pieces. Wow, this is actually a really hard example. So if you're having trouble with this one, I apologize, but I said something at the beginning that might be leading people to find or have trouble with this example, but okay, so f3 has been, or probably f4 suggested, or maybe e3. A few other thoughts suggested, but this is a really tough one. So to try and figure this out, if you're not really sure, I know a lot of people in the chat are shouting out the best answers, and we'll get to it because you are correct for most of you. But we want to start by looking at what are the unprotected pieces. Okay, this bishop is unprotected, this queen is unprotected, this rook is unprotected, and that looks to be it. So how can we exploit that? Well, we don't really have a good way to attack the rook here on g5, or I'm sorry, the bishop here on g5, but we do have a way to attack this undefended rook and this queen in the same move with a discovery. This is a very hard one to see, but the move here is rook to d1. So congratulations there's a handful of people in the chat who found this. Really, really impressive. We are discovered attacking this undefended queen, which is normally hard to do. It's normally hard to get a queen to be the target of this type of trick. But the reason this works is because white can't solve both of these problems. The queen has a bunch of places it can move, but none of them defend this unprotected rook. If you take our rook, I take your queen. And if you take my queen, well, what would I do then? Queen takes e8. How do I continue? It's a very nice sequence. Yes, we do not recapture the queen, and then we will lose our rook over here. Instead, rook takes e1 check. And unfortunately for white, this is actually going to be the game. Even though they still have this queen on the board, their king has no legal moves because of our bishop. So the rook will have to drop back, and we capture it and perform essentially the opera mating pattern, where our bishop and rook work together to deliver checkmate. So really, really nice idea there. All right, one more example on discoveries. Again, these ones are a little harder than the previous examples, but let's see what you can find. This is a fun one. So we're going to look for unprotected pieces, and exposed kings and see if we can use that to our advantage. This is also, again, a little tough because there's a few type of moves involved, but I think you'll be able to find it. Start by identifying which pieces are unprotected. And as you're thinking, I'll start thinking along with you. A few suggestions in the chat, and I'll just kind of let that fester for a little while. Okay, this pawn is unprotected. This queen, this bishop, and that looks like it, except for one very crucial piece that is involved in solving this puzzle. The queen is, again, normally hard to attack. Now, in this case, she is fairly cramped. We control a lot of these spaces, but without a dark squared bishop, or, you know, the fact that our knight can't attack her on the next move, probably going to be tough to get after the queen. This bishop is another good-looking candidate. We would love to try and go after this piece, but white has really good control of the files, the E and D files with their rooks, so that's also pretty tough to try and find a way to break in there. But a few people are pointing out we have a very nice idea, because white actually has one more unprotected piece. It's not just the bishop, the queen, and this pawn, or I'm sorry, both of these pawns, but actually, knight on f3, this is technically an unprotected piece because our queen is pinning the g pawn to the king. Now there's a problem we have, because the only piece we have that can take this knight is our queen. But if our queen moves to take it, then it's not pinning this pawn, which means we look very silly. But, as a few people have found, knight to f4, really, really beautiful move here. Opens up this diagonal for the bishop to attack this unprotected piece, and at the same time makes a counter threat. The knight and queen are working together to threaten checkmate on g2. Okay, well, you can either just push this g-pawn, which seems very bad, because I will be able to play check and still take the knight, and not really sure what you gain from that. So it only makes sense to take this knight on f4. And now, instead of recapturing the bishop, we play this very, very nice move. Oops, I'm sorry. Where's our position? Yeah, bishop takes f4. And we play this very nice move, bishop takes on f3. Attacking the rook and threatening checkmate. And this is, yeah, a very, very difficult situation. You can again play g3, although that is going to lose to queen to h3, and there's not any way to stop mate on g2. You could also play bishop back to g3, but then we get to capture this rook and win the exchange. And you could play an intermezzo, an in-between move. You could play rook takes e8, but that doesn't really solve the problem because I will simply recapture. And these two threats are still active, and you have to find a way to solve them, which there really are none. So this is a really, really nice example of how to exploit these unprotected pieces, and especially pieces that look protected, right? You know, this seems to be a very clearly protected piece, but if we remember our tactical vision and keep an eye out for these pins, we can recognize what's actually going on beneath the surface. All right, a couple more examples, and then I'm going to show you some real games and what's gone on and how this has been applied at all levels of play. So this is, let's see, an opening example that don't worry too much about what's particularly happening. I believe this is just, yeah, French defense with c5, you know, very normal stuff. Both sides attacking and defending. And in this position, white overlooks something. You know, very normal development ideas, pinning this knight, but then it's unpinned. And unfortunately here, there is an unprotected piece that we can take advantage of. And it's a really funny tactic. I've included this in a couple different lectures, this idea, because it comes up a fair amount in beginner games, and it's really useful to know. But this actually is related to the discovery idea we have looked at what are the unprotected pieces on white's side of the board? Okay, the 2 rooks, certainly, but hard to get at them. And that seems to be it, except this bishop. So this bishop is not defended. Maybe there's a way to exploit that. Okay, someone says take on d4 and then queen d5 check. That's a nice idea, except after they recapture, then this square frees up for the knight. Knight will go to c3 and defend. So that would look something like this. And even though the bishop is unprotected, knight to c3 will save the day. So it's a nice idea, but there's actually a more forcing one, which Teo, I believe in the chat, has found. Knight takes e5. And now we win this pawn, and there's a problem. If you take the knight, regardless of how you take it, your bishop is undefended. So I will capture it. And I have won a pawn, effectively. If you take my bishop, then the knight I just used that was on c6 boomerangs its way back to d7, out of harm's way, and I've picked up this pawn for free. So this is a very nice kind of tactic. It's really common. I don't know if it has an official name, but it's just kind of this discovery idea. And in this case, we find it because our opponent has this unprotected bishop here that allows us to exploit. All right. Let's take a look at one more example, and then we're going to talk about some of the ways this has actually happened. So in this position, it is black to move. And again, there's some complications going on here. I'm sorry. In this position, it's white to move. I apologize. In this position, the move white played was rook takes f6, thinking that we are just going to do a normal trade of rooks, and the game will continue. But unfortunately, white just overlooked something. So we will talk about the idea here. There's a very simple but very crucial problem with white's side of the board here. So after rook takes this rook trade, what is the problem that white has? Yes, they have unprotected their rook on a1, which is what this rook was doing before. So again, in the middle of a sequence of exchanges, you always want to keep an eye out on these unprotected pieces, because if we notice that, if we play a normal game, we might just take this rook, and then we're down some material still. We have this knight versus this rook. Or I guess its material is equal because we got a bunch of pawns, but it's a little unclear. But instead, queen takes a1 check. We hit their king first, and after they move, now we pick up both rooks. So a really nice tool to remember. Always look for the unprotected pieces. And I think this is actually more valuable to think of from the white side. In this type of position, it can look very natural to just say, okay, let's just trade pieces here. But you really want to be aware of your opponent's checks and your unprotected pieces. So the fact that this queen is attacking this rook, and if our other rook moves, it will be a check, is something you want to take note of before you decide to go through with any captures. Okay, a last few comments in the next 15 minutes we have here together. This one is just a really kind of common trick in the opening. And again, I'm thinking of this more from the side of, we've looked at how to pick apart unprotected pieces in our opponent's camp. Now let's do some work to prevent leaving things hanging on our end. So something that probably everyone who has played a handful of chess games has encountered before: e4, e5, queen h5. Early queen attacks, aggressive queen attacks. Some people get really frustrated by this type of thing because they know it's not so good, but they also struggle to find an answer to it. In this position, one of the critical ideas is to remember, what are the unprotected pieces here? What are the threats? So that's kind of two different questions. But the only thing that's unprotected on black side of the field right now is this e-pawn. Even though we know scholars' mates are coming and there's threats, we can deal with those as they come, but we don't want to leave anything hanging. So if you play some move like knight f6 or g6, you're going to be in serious trouble because you didn't deal with which pieces of yours were unprotected. But taking a second to look and say, okay, this pawn is unprotected, I will just defend. Even if they make future threats, you can still find the time to deal with them at the right moment. So yeah, developing and eventually the queen hang itself. This is usually what happens, but I would recommend, if you want to avoid falling into any of these pitfalls, looking at the unprotected pieces on both sides of the field. It's going to do you wonders. One more semi-tricky example here. In this position, it is white's turn to move, and there's a really nice idea. So let's start by finding the unprotected pieces, and then see if you can find a really good move for white. You'll probably find the move, and you might not see the problem, and it's not exactly a problem, but let's see. Okay, so bishop g4, I think you mean bishop g5, attacking the queen. This seems like a very solid idea. Perhaps just the queen goes to f5 and we initiate some kind of trade, but, you know, you're making a forcing move, so nothing wrong with that. But there is something that looks a little more tempting when we look at what's unprotected here. To me, when I look, I see, okay, the rooks are defending, all of this is defended, the pawns are all defended, really everything is safe, except two pieces. This knight and this bishop. Neither are defended. And then I notice, wait a minute, this pawn on d4, if I just take on c5, now I'm attacking both the knight and the bishop. And it seems like you can't solve both problems. But now put on your critical thinking hats, because this is still probably the best move. But unprotected pieces, as I've said, goes both ways. Black has a really excellent move here. So put in your thinking caps for black and say, okay, maybe you messed up, maybe you missed this, but you actually have a way out of it. What should black do here to stay in the game, not give up a piece? Anyone have any ideas? Again, this is a tricky move, but we're looking for something black can do. Even though these two pieces are both hit, I'll tell you, there's not really any checks that'll do anything, like queen to f5. Yeah, you can force a trade and get the knight out of the way, but we're still going to pick up this bishop. Queen c3, you must be a madman. Maybe there's some crazy checkmating idea, but I would be too afraid to try. So a few people have found it in the chat. No, you're good, James. I'm glad you were commenting. This is what we're here for. We're learning. Bishop b5 is actually the move in this position, because what's happening is we have found two unprotected pieces on black side of the camp, and they say, wait a minute, this bishop of yours isn't protective either. There's nothing protecting this piece. So when I play bishop to b5, it sort of sets up that boomerang idea like before. Okay, if you take me, now I take you, and the piece you were attacking is safe. And if you take me, I take you here. Either way, black maintains general material equality minus this one pawn that was initially traded, and they might be able to win that back, but that'll just see. We'll just have to see how that plays out. So don't give up. Even if you fall into a blunder or make a mistake, look out for opportunities where you can still make progress, and especially, again, unprotected pieces, it goes both ways. You really got to be aware. All right. I want to show you two positions from two Grandmaster games now. This first one was a game between Ushenina and Peter Svidler, and we're going to go... I'm going to skip kind of through the moves. It's a very solid opening where Anna gets a really nice center, but maybe is a little bit cramped with the pieces. The game continues. Black is up a pawn for a while, but again, Anna has some extra development. And we reach this position. So in this position, it's white's turn to move, and there's a few things going on. But I would start by looking at what are the unprotected pieces. This pawn on g6, this bishop on e5, this queen on a2, and this pawn on h6. All of these are unprotected. keep that in mind. White decides that this pawn on e6 is a weakness, because if I can take it, it's check, and maybe I can use the bishop to attack it. But I can't move the bishop right away. Like something like bishop to g4, or bishop to e2 to maybe come this way. These plans aren't going to work right away because rook and queen attack f2. If the bishop moves out of the way, we're going to be in trouble. I mean, maybe you could play bishop e2, but then there might be some other problems with like queen to d2. Or I'm sorry, there's a queen here. Regardless, the first move played is rook to f1. Just defending f2, not worrying about this being a later issue, and hoping that the bishop's going to move. So white would like to, on their next move, play bishop to g4 and put some pressure on this e6 pawn. Black plays the move h5 to prevent it. And now white plays a really excellent move. In this position, take a minute to see what you can find. This is a hard one, but white plays a really excellent move, capitalizing on the fact that that some of black's pieces are unprotected or could be unprotected. So take a moment. This is a hard move to find, but see what you can come up with. White to move. All right, start wrapping up your thinking caps. Okay, g4 been suggested in the chat. g4 unfortunately undefends this bishop on f3, so maybe rook can take. I'm not really worried about any like checks that white has, because then the rook can just drop back. So I'm not convinced by g4, but it's an interesting idea. And if bishop to g4, then I will just take with the pawn. So this is a very hard move to see, but the move actually played in the game. Teo actually found it. Yeah, bishop e2, question mark, exclaim. This piece is unprotected. We're just hanging it. But this queen is doing a very important job defending this pawn on e6, because if this queen moves out of the way of defense of this pawn and takes our bishop, then not only do we take this pawn, but we take it with check and hit this unprotected bishop. Uh-oh. We've won a pawn. At a Grandmaster level, that's a generally decisive advantage. So bishop e2, and you can't really take this. Okay, black plays rook f7. Queen to c8 check, rook to f8. Queen back to c6, once again threatening this pawn. Threatening the same maneuver as before if you take the bishop. So instead, bishop to d4 is played. Now, if you take the pawn, then at least you don't get the bishop. But this runs into bishop to c4, forking the queen and the pawn. In the game, now this does allow some trades here, but these were calculated ahead of time by Anna. And so what happens in the game is rook takes f2. Queen takes e6 check, kind of in between, and king to h7. You can't really play rook back to f7 here, even though it's check, because this is not defended. So instead, king h7, and white plays another very good move, queen to d7 check. Exposed king, an unprotected piece, means you're probably going to find a tactic. White just wins in this position. I believe Svidler resigns because if, say, rook f7 now, attacking, we just take it, so that doesn't work. And really, what else is there? You don't really have a lot of options. Bishop back to g7, then you lose your queen. So really, really nice win by Anna over Peter Svidler in that game. Let's look at one more example. Another Grandmaster game. This is Markus Ragger versus Ivan Popov. And again, we're kind of going to gloss over the opening of this game. but we're going to reach our critical position. Not as much as going to be on the board. And if you're not able to kind of follow along too well with finding these moves, that's okay. These are just kind of Grandmaster games that show, even at the highest level, applying this principle of finding unprotected pieces is super, super useful. In this position, white finds a really nice move. Black is up a pawn, but there are some issues in the black side of the board, and Markus decides to sacrifice the knight on g5. F takes, queen takes, 2 pawns for the knight, but this king is now very exposed. King goes to h8 to hide. And in this position, it is white to move. There are 2 equally good moves here, so see if you can find either one of them. White to move and find one of the 2 equally good moves. But you got to say why. So you have to say more than just the move. You probably have to say the whole line. So I'll give you a minute to try and figure this one out. Okay, bishop d7 suggested. All right, and James, because you've been getting a couple of these wrong, confidence boost here for you. Bishop d7 is one of the moves. It's actually the move that was played in the game. So that's one of the 2. Okay, rook f4 looks good. Threatens the bishop. And threatens rook h4. Yeah, rook h4 seems like a big threat. Yeah, rook f4 seems actually very good. I think there is a problem with this move. This is not one of the ideas. Black can get out of this. A tough one to find with rook to g8. Counterattacking white's queen. But otherwise a nice idea. So not rook f4. Rook e3, also not confident about. Well, we found the move that was played in the game, but the reason is the same. So bishop takes d7. I do want to explain. The idea is this. If this rook captures, then this rook will be unprotected. If you take here first, which is what happens in the game, then rook takes, and there's a bit of a similar problem. Although now, if this rook takes, instead of taking here, we just have a checkmating idea. So queen takes d7 is what was played, but then queen to e5, and we pick up the unprotected bishop. So all the way back in this position, this whole idea is just because this bishop is not protected enough. Now you can't just take it right away. This is not good. Or I'm sorry, it's protected by the queen. My apologies. So we either displace the queen or we displace the rook, and either way, black is in a lot of trouble if they try and save it. So using this idea of unprotected pieces, or in this case, at higher levels, cleverly forcing our opponent to unprotect their own pieces, can be really, really valuable. So the really key themes from this whole lesson, again, if those last 5-10 minutes went over your head, that's okay. These are Grandmaster games, and they are applying lots and lots of these tactical puzzles and principles and strategic ideas at the highest level. But really the key idea is just to know that if your opponent has unprotected pieces or an exposed king, and hopefully a combination, really take a second and look out for tactical opportunities to punish them. Likewise, if you have unprotected pieces or your king is exposed, be really watchful for your opponent to create those tactical opportunities themselves. I thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully I will see you again sometime soon, but until then, take care.